All right. First up, we got Joe Walano. You want to come on up?
Yeah.
Joe's been working on Moto Guzzi since the 1970s, if I'm correct, and 1970s bikes. So I'm sure he's got a lot of stories.
Yeah.
Put your hands together for Joe.
How are you? Where's Season at? She back there?
I'm right here.
Season, thanks so much for doing this and putting me on first because, you know, I can't stay up too late. So anyway,
So right there, Mike.
oh, this mic right here?
There you go.
All right. So I'm not going to talk about Moto Guzzis tonight. I hope it doesn't disappoint you. My particular, I think the theme tonight is rescue. So my story tonight is about an adventure that I had twice, but the first one is what I'm going to talk about. So some of you know that I was involved in the motorcycle Cannonball, and started in 2016 is where we participated. It started with a phone call from my friend Fred Wacker, and he asked me, he said, hey, I've been on a waiting list to get on the motorcycle Cannonball, and they called me up, and we got 24 hours to let them know if we want to do it. I'm like, all right, what is it? He said, well, it's a cross-country endurance race on antique motorcycles. And they've been, I think it was the fourth running. They started in 2010. A couple of guys out of Sturgis, South Dakota decided they were bored with just looking at their motorcycles and decided to ride them cross-country. So it moved on in a couple of different forms, different routes. But in 2016, the route was Atlantic City, New Jersey to Carlsbad, California, about 3,400 miles. And just for laughs, all the bikes had to be over 100 years old. So I'm like, all right, how hard could this be? So I said, all right, Fred, well, what do you got? He goes, well, I got my dad's 1913 Indian. It's been in the family room for about 40 years. It's been restored, but it hasn't run in a while. Well, okay, let's do it. So talk a little bit more about the Cannonball. So the Cannonball, it's a points-based, it's a competition. The winner gets this really nice bronze trophy, and everybody else gets bragging rights. The bikes in this particular run were rated in 3 classes. Class 1 was single cylinder, single speed. So that would be like your belt drive Harley Davidsons. And then class 2, which is what we were multi-cylinder single speeds. The Indian we had was that. And then there were single-cylinder multi-speeds. Those are also class 2. And then everything else, which was multi-cylinder multi-speed bikes. The rider got a point for every mile he completed under his own power. There were penalties for rider changes, coming in late, traffic citations, and not that these things could break the speed limit. You know, so the oldest bike, lowest class, would win. So a class 1 bike would beat a class 2 bike. And the tiebreaker would be the age of the rider. So this took 16 days, 3,400 miles over 16 days. So the bike we were going to run is a 1913 Indian Twin. It's basically a very large bicycle, clincher tires, still had the pedals on it. That's how you start it. It had a 1,000cc V-twin in it, 61 cubic inch, and made about 7 horsepower. It only had a rear brake. This bike was way ahead of its time because it had suspension on the front and the back, springs on both. And it came in 2 models. We had the base model, which I believe in 13, they made 32,000 of them, which is a lot of bikes in 1913. It was $200. And for $250, you could get the GP model, which came with a 2-speed transmission and this new revolutionary new thing called a Kickstarter. So in January of 16, we pulled this Indian out of Fred's family room, brought it to my shop, and proceeded to find out that there was no way this bike was going to run. So I spent the next 8 months tearing it down, rebuilding the motor. I had a lot of help, a lot of advice from people all over the country. I put a front brake on it. We put modern tires on it, auxiliary fuel tank. So we were told that at one point we were going to have to go 90 miles between gas stops. What else did I do? I had to put lights on. The bike didn't have lights. So we did a total loss LED light in the front. And after 8 months, the bike was pretty much ready to go. We put about 50 miles on it, and we packed up in the trailer, and we headed to Atlantic City. We, excuse me. We get to Atlantic City, and we're staying at a casino hotel, big parking lot. We pull in, and it's just this amazing scene. There's Prevost buses with rolling machine shops behind them, and then all the way down to a dad. And Mark, you know Bill Redensel, right? Where's Mark? Matt.
Yeah, I know Bill.
You know Bill.
Yeah.
So Bill and his daughters were on this run. His two teenage daughters drove the minivan with a little trailer behind it, and Bill rode this flat track bike with straight pipes and low bars. But the point being is that it was everything from teams with 4 bikes and riders and mechanics down to a husband and wife with a minivan, and we're gonna ride across country. So we set up a little bit, we did a little testing, and then this is the Saturday after Labor Day, we started heading west. 106 motorcycles in all. We did pretty good the first week. In West Virginia, we broke an exhaust valve spring, which put Fred on the side of the road. Fred, clarified, Fred was the rider, I was the builder and backup support. Broke a valve spring, got picked up by the sweep truck that the organization provides, and then he had to ride what was known as the bus of shame. And it was just a mini school bus, and they'd get on it, and everybody who rode the bus of shame autographed the inside, and everybody who didn't ride the bus of shame autographed the outside. And so they brought the bike to me, and I caught, our next stop was Chillicothe, Ohio, and they brought the bike to me, and I had spares, so I replaced the valve spring, took the bike for a ride, and I learned 2 things that night: was how to pronounce Chillicothe and what hydrogen embrittlement is. And I had no idea what it was before, and if you want to know, I'll talk to you later. So the rest of the week went pretty smooth. Almost lost the swing arm pivot in Bloomington. Got to Dodge City, Kansas that following Saturday, and Sunday was our rest day. We did some repairs. I fixed the brake, kind of. I fixed an exhaust, kind of. Just kind of got this thing ready to go. And the next day, our route took us to Pueblo, Colorado. And Fred made all the miles that day, gets to the hotel, and every night I would do a shakedown run when he would come in. Just take the bike. Because sometimes we stop at a Harley dealer or a bike dealer somewhere and have to ride it to the hotel or whatever. This particular night we had what they call a parc fermé, very fancy. But a couple blocks down there was a brew pub, and it had been an Excelsior motorcycle dealer in the early 1900s. And they wanted to recreate this photograph that they had of all these Excelsior motorcycles parked out front. So they parked all these 100-plus-year-old motorcycles out front, and as you can expect, it took a long time. But when I went to ride it over there, the bike started kind of hard. It didn't run really well. I'm like, well, I'm going to have to look into this. Probably needs plugs, whatever. So I go to start the bike to ride it back, and it won't start. This bike always started. Speaking of that, if you when you get a chance, go to the Guzzi Doctor Instagram, check my reels, and there's a reel of Fred starting this bike. He started with the pedals. So anyway, I had to pedal it back a couple of blocks. And it's like a 350-pound bicycle. And I pedaled it back. I get to my little work area. I got the easy up. I got a light. I got a work table. And I start trying to figure out why the bike won't start. These were my first 2 rescuers showed up, Brian and Dave. Brian had inherited his grandfather's motorcycle collection, and one of the bikes was a 1912 Indian Twin. So he's kind of familiar with him. So he worked with me, and we figured out that the magneto had failed. The good news was that I had a spare magneto. the bad news was the engine had to come out of the frame to replace the magneto. So Brian helped me, and his buddy Dave had one of those tactical, LED flashlights, and he kind of just stood behind me the whole time, just pointing the flashlight wherever I was working. These guys stayed out in the parking lot with me until 2:30 in the morning. Brian and I worked on the bike, got the magneto put back in, engine back in the bike. I got it running, I fired it up. The parking lot at this point is deserted. It's us and a security guard. I get on the bike and I take it for a little ride, and it ran fine, but there was a very, very bad noise coming from the bottom end. Brought it back to my little pit area, drained the oil, and there was a little swirl of brass shavings in the oil. This bike has roller bearings on the rods, but the main bearings are brass bushings. So I figured with that noise and the brass, this engine's not going to stay together a lot longer. So I loaded the bike up in the trailer, put my tools away, said goodbye and thank you to my two new friends. I think it was about a little after 3 when I finally got to bed, and I met Fred down in the lobby a little after 6. So Fred's sleeping the whole time, okay? So he comes down, and it's like, we're not riding today. And I told him, I said, we got a choice. David told me about a bike shop in town. The guy did a lot of panhead work and whatever, might be able to help us. Or we could continue on with the moving circus across country and head to our next stop, which was Durango. And we decided the best bet was to keep up with the traveling circus. And I want to talk about, I call it a circus, but it's really a spectacle. I mean, every hotel parking lot across the country, it was just this, it was like a moving carnival. All the support people would show up with our vans and our trucks. We'd put up our easy-ups and our workstations, wait for the riders to come in, and people were rebuilding motors. One kid was working in a van, he had a layout, he's making a piston at like 10 o'clock at night. And, so this is like, I consider these people the royalty of antique motorcycles. They've devoted their lives to old bikes. So we get to, Fred drove, I got a little more sleep. Fred drove, we get to Durango, I set up camp, set up my work table. Fred checks us in, he grabs us some lunch, and I start taking the engine back out that I just put in 12 hours earlier and take it apart, and I find that the crankcase, the timing side of the crankcase had broken. Fortunately, the crankshaft had stayed together, but I had this broken crankcase. So this could have been a ride-ending problem, seriously. But we had friends. This Indian is known as a Hedstrom motor. Oscar Hedstrom was one of the founding partners in Indian motorcycles, and he designed this engine. And there were 4 other Hedstrom twins on the run. So I made a phone call. First to our friends out in Nebraska. They had some main bearings. They had a welder. I knew somebody that had a mill. So that was a possibility, but that was going to be a lot of work. I made another phone call, and these are my next 2 rescuers, were Linda and Larry Monahan from Northern California. And Larry goes, hey, I got a spare crankcase. Just a half for a 14. So he's like, you can borrow it if you want. And I'm like, this is big. I mean, this is a 102-year-old crankcase, and it's got the bushings in it I need, but it's got the serial number on it too. So that it went to a bike. This is what you needed to build a bike. You needed this half of the crankcase. So unlike a lot of other towns, Durango, the hotels were spread around. So we had to drive across town, grab the case, back to the trailer. I did a little work with a portable grinder and some valve lapping compound, and I got the shafts, the camshaft and the magneto shaft and the oil pump drive shaft in there. And I was getting ready to drop the crankshaft in because this is where you set your timing, and I was a little confused on how to set the cam timing. Rescuers 5 and 6 showed up. So my buddy Art from Pennsylvania that I just met a week earlier, and his friend Todd, who was local, stopped by to see how things are going. And Todd had just put together a 1914 Indian twin. How much a chances of that? And he goes, I had to go all the way back to the 1908 handbook to find out where the timing marks were supposed to be. And he goes, I just did it. He goes, I got it at home, but this is how you do it. Great. So I put the bottom end put the crank in. I literally glued the bottom end of this engine together. And by now it's 9 p.m. And I probably had maybe 2 hours of sleep in a hotel and 3 hours of sleep in a car. And I'm like, we've already lost a half a day in West Virginia. We've lost a full day here. We're out of the running. We're not going to make the points. But I don't want to be putting this together and make another mistake and set us back even farther. So we packed it in for the night. Next morning we got up. It was raining. Fred and I worked, had the bike running at about noon. Loaded it up in the trailer and headed off for our next stop, which was Page, Arizona. And now we were back down to sea level, so I didn't really ride it very much up in Durango. So I would have had to adjust the carburetor anyway. So back down to sea level, adjusted the carburetor, took it for a little ride, a couple of zip ties here and a little safety wire there, and he was ready for the last 4 days of the ride. So those 6 people helped us get that far. So once we left Page, we had 4 more days to get to Carlsbad. And the night before Carlsbad, things were starting to really fall off the bike. So by the time we got to Carlsbad, the engine is banging like crazy again. I've got JB weld, safety wire, and orange silicone sealer everywhere. But we made it. We finished, I think it was either 41st or 44th out of the original 106. Only 55 made it. You had to complete like the first day and the last day, and then like 5 of the days in between. There was a certain amount of time you had to ride to be considered finishing. So because we rode the first day and the last day and only missed 2.5 in the middle, we actually finished. So 44th out of 55. 12 bikes made all the miles. None of them were class 1s. One class 1 got really close, and he won an 18. And the other ones were all Hendersons, and we don't like Hendersons. Well, they cheat. They got 4 cylinders, anyway. So anyway, that's my story. I had 6 terrific people help me out, plus countless others along the way. It was an adventure that I'll never forget. The mechanical challenge was why I did it. I just can't see myself riding 3,400 miles at 35 miles an hour. I would either blow my brains out or blow the engine up trying to go fast. So the bike averaged about 37 miles an hour. So we got back, and people were like, "Are you going to do it again?" And we're like, "No." No. And then a couple weeks later, somebody goes, "You gonna do it again?" We're like, "Maybe." And then, "You're gonna do it again?" "Well, maybe, but on a different bike." And then we ended up doing it on the same bike in 18. And we took first in our class and second overall.
All right, that was Joe,
Yeah.
the Cannonball racer.